Have you ever watched someone sleeping peacefully and had that fleeting, unsettling thought, what if they never woke up? For most, it's a momentary anxiety, quickly dismissed. For the families in these true stories, it became a devastating reality. This is a journey into the shadows of night, where for some, the boundary between sleep and death becomes heartbreakingly thin. When night falls, the vulnerability of sleep, that daily surrender of consciousness we all require, is perhaps the most vulnerable state we regularly enter. Our breathing slows, our awareness dims, and our body's defenses relax. We trust implicitly that our vital functions will continue their silent work through the night. Yet for some, this trust is tragically betrayed when the night claims more than just hours of consciousness. Miranda Patel, neurologist and sleep researcher at Johns Hopkins University, explains, during sleep, particularly deep sleep, our body undergoes significant physiological changes. Heart rate variability increases, blood pressure fluctuates, and even our breathing patterns alter. For most people, these changes are perfectly natural and harmless. But for those with underlying conditions, even ones they may not know they have, these normal sleep processes can sometimes trigger catastrophic events. What makes sleep-related deaths particularly haunting is their silence. There's rarely a struggle, rarely a chance to call for help. One moment, life continues in unconscious rhythm. The next, it ceases altogether, often without waking the person or disturbing their peaceful appearance. The silent killers, what claims lives in the night. The breath that never returns, sleep apnea's hidden danger. James Thornton's last night. James Thornton's wife, Marla, had grown accustomed to his thunderous snoring over their 22 years of marriage. At 54, James was overweight, but otherwise seemingly healthy. A devoted father of 3 who worked as a high school principal in Savannah, Georgia. He laughed about his snoring. Marla recalls, her voice breaking slightly during our interview. He called it his bear impression and joked that it kept burglars away. I begged him to see a doctor, but he always said he felt fine. James would often stop breathing momentarily during sleep, sometimes for alarming stretches, before gasping and resuming his snoring. Neither he nor Marla realized these were classic symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea, where the throat tissues collapse and block the airway. On the night of April 17, 2023, after attending their daughter's piano recital, James went to bed around 11 p.m. Marla stayed up late finishing work and joined him around 1 a.m. She noticed his snoring seemed less pronounced than usual, but thought nothing of it. I actually remember thinking, "Oh good, a quiet night," she says, her eyes filling with tears. If only I had known that the silence wasn't a blessing. When their alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., Marla reached over to wake James, finding his skin cool to the touch. The medical examiner later determined that James had suffered a cardiac arrhythmia triggered by an extended period without oxygen, a direct complication of his undiagnosed sleep apnea. The most devastating part, Marla explains, is knowing it was potentially preventable. A sleep study, a CPAP machine. These might have given our children more years with their father. Now all I have is this mission to tell others. Don't ignore the snoring. The Thornton family's tragedy illustrates a cruel irony. The symptom that might have saved James, his loud snoring, had become so normalized in their household that its warning went unheeded. The betrayal from within, cardiac rhythm disorders, the dance instructor who never missed a beat until her last, Sofia Alvarez, lived for rhythm. At 32, she had built a successful career as a dance instructor in Miami, known for her infectious energy and the way she could feel music in her soul. Her students described her as perpetually in motion, which made the stillness of her death all the more shocking. Sophia was the healthiest person I knew, says her roommate and fellow dancer, Tiana. She ate clean, didn't smoke, barely drank. She could dance for hours without getting winded. There were zero red flags. Yet beneath Sophia's vibrant exterior lurked an invisible threat. Long QT syndrome, a genetic heart rhythm disorder that can cause chaotic, potentially fatal heart rhythms, particularly during rest. The condition often goes undiagnosed until it claims a life. On the evening of June 3, 2022, Sophia taught 2 consecutive hip-hop classes, grabbed dinner with colleagues, then headed home for an early night before a weekend dance convention. She texted her mother at 9:43 p.m., exhausted but happy. "This weekend's going to be amazing. Love you, al salama." It was the last communication anyone would receive from her. When Sophia didn't show up for the convention the following morning, something entirely out of character, Tiana returned to their apartment to find her roommate looking peaceful in bed, as though still sleeping. "I called her name from the doorway," Tiana remembers, her voice hollow. "When she didn't respond, I knew. I just knew something was horribly wrong before I even touched her." The autopsy revealed Sophia had died from sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to long QT syndrome. Like many with the condition, she had never experienced symptoms obvious enough to warrant cardiac testing. Perhaps an occasional racing heartbeat she had attributed to caffeine or exercise enthusiasm. "What haunts me," says Sophia's mother, Elena, "is that she died alone. This vibrant, beautiful soul, who filled rooms with energy, just slipped away in the darkness, with no one holding her hand." Cardiologist Dr. Lawrence Chen explains that long QT syndrome deaths often occur during sleep because the transition between sleep stages creates a vulnerable period for the heart's electrical system. The autonomous nervous system shifts, and in people with these conditions, that shift can sometimes trigger fatal arrhythmias. What makes Sophia's story particularly tragic is that, had the condition been diagnosed, simple preventive measures, beta blockers, or an implantable defibrillator might have saved her life. The environmental assassin, carbon monoxide, the winter that claimed the Bradford family. The Bradford family, Thomas 41, Rebecca 39, and their children, Ellie 12 and Noah 9, were beloved fixtures in their small New Hampshire community. Thomas coached Little League, Rebecca volunteered at the library. Their children were bright students at the local school. When none of them showed up for their respective obligations on a cold February morning in 2024, concerned neighbors called the police for a welfare check. Officer Samantha Holden still struggles to discuss what she found. "It looked like they were sleeping," she says quietly, "all 4 of them in their beds, looking peaceful. No signs of struggle or distress." It's the kind of scene that stays with you. The silent killer had been a malfunctioning furnace in their recently renovated 1920s home, leaking carbon monoxide throughout the night. The family had installed smoke detectors, but not carbon monoxide alarms. The family had installed smoke detectors, but not carbon monoxide alarms, a distinction that proved fatal. What makes carbon monoxide particularly insidious is that it's completely undetectable to human senses. Odorless, completely undetectable to human senses. Odorless, colorless. It binds to hemoglobin in the blood with an affinity 200 to 200 noxes, 250 times greater than oxidine, gradually the fighting reflex would normally wake, triggering the gasping reflex that would normally wake someone who can't breathe. The psychological horror of carbon monoxide poisoning, explains toxicology Amir Najafi, is that victims typically don't know they're in danger. That the early symptoms, headache, dizziness, confusion, can be subtle and are easily attributed to other causes, especially if they occur when someone is already tired and headed to bed. Once unconscious, there's no chance to recognize the danger. The Bradford family's funeral drew over 600 attendees from their community. A fund established in their name has since provided carbon monoxide detectors to more than 1,500 local homes. If there's any meaning to be found in such a senseless tragedy, says Thomas's brother William, it's in the lives that might be saved by their story. Please check your furnace. Install CO detectors on every floor. Don't assume your smoke alarms are enough. The unexplained, when science has no answers. The mystery of Ethan Walsh. Perhaps most unsettling are the cases where modern medicine can provide no clear explanation for why someone never wakes up. 26-year-old Ethan Walsh falls into this category. A software developer with a passion for mountain biking, Ethan had no known health conditions. His medical checkup just 3 months before his death had shown normal results across all standard tests. He was training for a century ride, says his partner, Alex. He could bike 60 miles in a day and feel energized afterward. There were absolutely no warning signs. On November 12, 2023, after a routine Sunday spent grocery shopping, meal prepping for the week, and watching a movie with Alex, Ethan went to bed around 10:30 p.m. When Alex's alarm went off at 6 a.m., they discovered Ethan unresponsive. Despite aggressive resuscitation attempts by paramedics and hospital staff, Ethan could not be revived. Even more puzzling, the subsequent autopsy and toxicology screening revealed no obvious cause of death. No cardiac abnormalities, no brain hemorrhage, no signs of respiratory failure, no drugs or alcohol, no evidence of seizure. Ethan's death certificate reads sudden unexplained death in adults, a diagnosis of exclusion that offers little closure to those left behind. Not knowing why is its own special kind of torture, Alex explains. There's this constant questioning. Was there something I missed? Could I have done something? Was there a warning sign neither of us recognized? And there's the fear too. If it happened to him, for no apparent reason, couldn't it happen to anyone? To me, medical examiner, Dr. Leanne Yamamoto, acknowledges the psychological burden such cases place on families. We've made tremendous advances in understanding the human body, but there remain cases where our current science simply cannot determine what went wrong. For families, this uncertainty can significantly complicate the grieving process. Some of these unexplained deaths may eventually be attributed to genetic cardiac conditions not detectable on standard autopsy, or to subtle seizure disorders that leave no physical evidence. Ongoing research into sudden, unexplained death continues, but for now, cases like Ethan's remain medically mysterious and emotionally devastating for survivors. The psychological impact, living with the specter of sleep death. The psychological aftermath for those who lose loved ones to sleep-related death carries unique burdens. Many survivors report developing their own sleep disturbances, lying awake watching their children or partners breathe, or waking repeatedly to check on loved ones. I haven't had a full night's sleep since James died, admits Marla Thornton. I keep thinking I hear someone gasping for air. I've woken my other children up countless times just to make sure they're still breathing. This hypervigilance represents a normal grief response, but can develop into lasting anxiety disorders when not addressed. Sleep specialists increasingly recommend counseling for family members who've experienced such losses. Psychologist Dr. Vanessa Torres, who specializes in grief counseling, explains, when someone dies in their sleep, it challenges our fundamental sense of safety in a very primal way. Sleep is supposed to be restorative, healing, not dangerous. Having that basic trust violated
can create profound anxiety that requires professional support to address. Medical warning signs: when to seek help. While not all sleep-related deaths can be prevented, certain warning signs merit immediate medical attention. Excessive daytime sleepiness, despite adequate hours of sleep. Loud, chronic snoring, particularly with gasping or choking sounds. Observed pauses in breathing during sleep. Morning headaches that resolve after being awake for a while. Unexplained heart palpitations or chest discomfort. Family history of sudden cardiac death or unexplained death. Waking up with a racing heart. Extreme fatigue disproportionate to activity levels. Dr. Samuel Klein, a pulmonologist specializing in sleep medicine, emphasizes these symptoms don't necessarily mean you have a life-threatening condition, but they absolutely warrant evaluation. Many of the conditions that can cause death during sleep are treatable when caught early. The science of sleep vulnerability. What makes sleep a potentially dangerous state for those with certain conditions? Several factors converge. Physiological transitions. As we cycle through sleep stages, our body undergoes significant physiological shifts. Blood pressure drops, heart rate varies, body temperature decreases, and breathing patterns change. For those with underlying conditions, these transitions can sometimes trigger catastrophic events. Reduced responsiveness. During sleep, our body's ability to respond to warning signals diminishes. Carbon dioxide buildup that would normally trigger gasping in a conscious person might not generate enough response during deep sleep. An irregular heartbeat that might cause someone to seek help when awake may progress unchecked during sleep. Extended duration. Most people spend about a third of their lives asleep, approximately 6 my-turnies, 8 continuous hours daily. This extended period, without conscious monitoring, creates a substantial window of vulnerability for those with certain conditions. Positional factors. Sleep position can exacerbate some conditions. Back sleeping often worsens sleep apnea. Certain positions may restrict blood flow or breathing in ways that become problematic only during the relaxed state of sleep. Protecting yourself and loved ones. While the stories shared here may evoke anxiety,
What's particularly challenging about sleep-related death research, explains Dr. Catherine Williams, a neurologist specializing in sleep disorders, is that the event of interest, the actual moment when physiological systems fail, generally occurs unwitnessed and unmonitored. We're often working backward from limited evidence to understand complex cascading failures in interrelated systems. Despite these challenges, progress continues. Recent research has identified several potential biomarkers that might help identify those at elevated risk before tragedy strikes. Advanced genetic screening can now detect dozens of variants associated with increased risk of sudden cardiac death. The road forward, hope amid fear. While the stories shared here illuminate the vulnerability inherent in sleep, they also highlight paths toward prevention and protection. Medical vigilance, appropriate screening for those with concerning symptoms or family history, environmental safeguards like carbon monoxide detectors, and lifestyle modifications can all reduce risks significantly. Most importantly, awareness of warning signs ensures that potentially dangerous conditions don't go unaddressed. For those who have experienced the trauma of finding a loved one who passed during sleep, support groups offer connections with others who truly understand this unique grief. Organizations like the Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndromes Foundation provide resources specifically for families affected by sudden cardiac death. The final dream: finding peace with sleep. Despite the shadow that sleep-related deaths cast, sleep itself remains essential to life and health. Finding balance between reasonable vigilance and paralyzing fear becomes the challenge for those touched by these tragedies. I still check on my remaining children more often than other parents might, admits Marla Thornton. But I've learned to limit myself to once a night. I've had to make peace with the reality that we can't control everything, that some risks exist no matter how vigilant we are. This hard-won wisdom, that absolute safety is an illusion, that life contains inherent vulnerabilities we cannot eliminate, represents perhaps the most profound legacy of those who have departed during sleep. These stories remind us of both our fragility and our resilience in the face of life's ultimate uncertainties. Ethan loved sleeping, says Alex with a sad smile. He said it was like a mini vacation every night. After he died, I couldn't sleep in our bed for months. But eventually, I came to see sleep the way he did, as a gift, a necessary restoration. I think he would want me to enjoy it without fear. In that perspective lies perhaps the healthiest approach to the reality of sleep: vulnerability, acknowledgement without obsession, precaution without paranoia, and ultimately, surrender to the natural rhythm of consciousness and unconsciousness that defines human existence. For most of us, the light of morning will indeed come again, and in that awakening lies the daily miracle we so often take for granted, until something or someone reminds us just how precious each awakening truly is. Resources for those concerned about sleep-related health risks. Medical resources: American Academy of Sleep Medicine, AA, provides physician referrals and information about accredited sleep centers. American Heart Association offers resources on heart rhythm disorders and cardiovascular health. Sudden Arrhythmia, Death Syndromes Foundation, support and information for families affected by cardiac rhythm disorders. American Sleep Apnea Association, education and support for those with sleep-disordered breathing. Support groups, parents of sudden cardiac arrest, death victims, carbon monoxide survivors network, bereaved spouses, support communities, unexpected loss, grief counseling, networks, safety, resources, consumer, product, safety, commission, guidelines for preventing carbon monoxide poisoning, American Red Cross, home safety checklists, National Fire Protection Association, carbon monoxide alarm, information, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, sleep health resources, when to seek emergency help if you experience or witness severe difficulty breathing during sleep, choking or gasping episodes during sleep, chest pain or pressure during the night, severe dizziness upon waking, confusion or disorientation upon waking, seizure-like activity during sleep. This article is intended for informational purposes only and should not replace consultation with qualified medical professionals. If you have concerns about sleep-related health issues, please consult your physician. Maria Sanchez lived the kind of life that rarely makes headlines. At 43, she worked as a librarian in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, population 5,742. Her colleagues described her as quietly competent, with a gift for connecting children with books that would spark their imaginations. She lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house inherited from her grandmother, tended a garden renowned for its heirloom tomatoes, and volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. Maria was the backbone of this community in ways most people never noticed, explains Judith Winters, the head librarian and Maria's friend of 15 years. She knew everyone's reading preferences, remembered their children's names, and quietly slipped grocery store gift cards into the books of families she knew were struggling. What few people knew was that Maria had struggled with insomnia since her early 20s. She rarely spoke about it, viewing it as a private battle rather than a topic for conversation. Those close to her occasionally noticed the subtle signs, the concealer under her eyes after particularly difficult nights, the extra cup of coffee in the afternoon, the gentle deflection when evening plans ran too late. I asked her about it once, Judith recalls. She just smiled and said, "Some people aren't meant to sleep through the night. I've made my peace with it." And that was Maria, always making peace with the difficult things, never complaining. What Maria didn't realize was that her chronic insomnia had masked a more serious underlying condition. The sleep studies she had undergone in her 30s had focused primarily on her difficulty falling and staying asleep. None had detected the subtle cardiac arrhythmia that occurred primarily during her transition to deep sleep, a condition that specialists would later identify as a rare variant of Brugada syndrome. The medication decision on April 12, 2023, Maria visited Dr. Eleanor Chen, a new sleep specialist who had recently joined the regional medical center. After reviewing Maria's history and conducting a fresh assessment, Dr. Chen prescribed a sleep medication that had shown promise for patients with similar insomnia profiles. I specifically asked about side effects. Maria texted her sister that evening. Dr. Chen said the most common ones are morning grogginess and vivid dreams. "Honestly, I'd take both if it means actually sleeping through the night for once." Maria filled the prescription that same day. She followed the instructions meticulously, taking the medication with a full glass of water, avoiding alcohol, and settling into bed 30 minutes after taking the pill. She had even prepared for the morning grogginess by setting multiple alarms and asking Judith to call her if she wasn't at work by 9:15 a.m. What neither Maria nor Dr. Chen could have known was how this particular medication would interact with Maria's undiagnosed cardiac condition. In most patients, the medication simply enhanced the normal transition between sleep stages. In Maria's case, it would amplify the exact electrical irregularity that made her heart vulnerable. The last evening, April 15th, was a Sunday. Maria spent the day she typically did, tending her garden in the morning, volunteering at the animal shelter in the afternoon, and preparing for the week ahead in the evening. She called her mother in Arizona, as she did every Sunday, chatting about neighborhood news and swapping recipes. She sounded happy, her mother, Elena Sanchez, later recalled. And she was excited about finally getting some decent sleep with this new medication. The last thing she said to me was that she'd call again next Sunday to let me know how it was working. At 8:47 p.m., Maria texted Judith, "Third night on the new meds, fingers crossed for a full night's sleep. Meeting prep is done for tomorrow." At 9:12 p.m., she sent one final text to her sister, having a strange reaction to the sleep meds. "Heart feels fluttery. Probably nothing, but if it's still happening tomorrow, I'll call the doctor." She never made that call. The discovery. When Maria failed to arrive at the library by 9:15 a.m. on Monday, Judith called, as they had arranged. The call went straight to voicemail. Slightly concerned but not alarmed, technology fails. After all, Judith called again at 9:30, then at 9:45. By 10 a.m., with no response to calls or texts, Judith's concern had evolved into genuine worry. "It wasn't like Maria to be unreachable," Judith explains. "She was the most reliable person I knew, and she knew I'd be waiting to hear from her about the new medication." Judith asked another librarian to cover the front desk and drove to Maria's house. She found the morning newspaper still on the porch and Maria's car in the driveway. Using the spare key Maria had given her years ago for plant watering during vacations, Judith entered the house. Everything was so normal, Judith remembers, her voice catching. The coffee maker was set up for the morning brew, just not turned on. Her clothes were laid out for work, her bag was packed. It was like she had every intention of waking up and continuing her day. Judith found Maria in her bed, appearing so peaceful,
that for a moment she thought her friend was simply sleeping deeply for the first time in decades. I called her name from the doorway, then a little louder. When she didn't stir, I went closer and touched her shoulder. That's when I knew.
The aftermath. The medical examiner would later determine that Maria had experienced a fatal cardiac arrhythmia during her sleep. The specific sleep medication she had been prescribed had not caused her death, but it had likely facilitated the conditions under which her underlying Brugada syndrome became fatal, deepening her sleep enough that her body didn't rouse itself when the arrhythmia began. It's a devastating coincidence, Dr. Elizabeth Patel, a cardiac electrophysiologist consulted on the case, explains. Sanchez had likely experienced these arrhythmias many times before, but her usual sleep patterns, fragmented and light, may have actually protected her by allowing her body to adjust positions or briefly wake, interrupting the dangerous rhythm. The medication did exactly what it was supposed to do. It helped her achieve deeper sleep. Tragically, in her specific case, that deeper sleep removed a protective mechanism. For the Cedar Ridge community, Maria's death created ripples of impact that expanded far beyond her immediate circle. The library established a memorial garden with a bench where children could read outdoors. The animal shelter named their cat room in her honor. Local physicians began recommending cardiac screening before prescribing certain sleep medications, but the most profound impacts were felt by those closest to her. I couldn't sleep for months afterward, Judith admits. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake in a panic, convinced that sleep itself was dangerous. The irony that Maria, who had struggled her entire adult life to get enough sleep, would die once she finally found something that helped her rest. It's almost too much to bear. Maria's sister, Anna, channeled her grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation that provides funding for cardiac screening in patients with sleep disorders. We can't bring Maria back, Anna says, but we can prevent other families from experiencing this particular kind of loss. The dreams that never came among Maria's personal effects. Her family found a journal she had kept sporadically. The final entry, written the night before her death, offers a poignant glimpse into her mindset. Night 3, on the new medication. Last 2 nights, I've slept better than I have in years. My dreams have been so vivid, Technicolor movies playing in my mind. Last night, I dreamed I was swimming in the ocean, something I've always been too afraid to do in real life. The water was warm, cradling me like I was weightless. I spent so many years dreading nighttime, fighting against sleep. Now I find myself looking forward to it. Tomorrow, I'm going to ask Dr. Chen if this is what normal sleep feels like for most people. If it is, I've been missing out on something extraordinary all these years. Perhaps it's not too late to become a good sleeper, after all. Maria's mother keeps this journal entry framed on her bedside table. It comforts me, she explains, to know that her last conscious experiences were peaceful ones, that after all those years of struggling, she finally found rest. The undetected danger. What makes Maria's story particularly relevant to discussions of sleep-related death is how easily her condition went undetected, despite her extensive medical history related to sleep disorders. Brugada syndrome can be challenging to diagnose, explains Dr. Patel. The electrical signature it creates isn't always present on standard EKGs, and unless a physician is specifically looking for it, the subtle signs can be overlooked. In Miss Sanchez's case, her insomnia had become the medical focus, potentially obscuring the underlying cardiac issue. This pattern, where one medical condition masks or distracts from another, appears repeatedly in cases of sleep-related death. The human body is a complex system, and symptoms don't always present in textbook fashion. Medical specialization, while necessary, for depth of expertise can sometimes create silos that prevent the connections between seemingly unrelated symptoms from being recognized. In retrospect, Dr. Chen acknowledges there were subtle indicators in Miss Sanchez's medical history that might have warranted cardiac evaluation before prescribing sleep medication. Her mention of occasional heart palpitations, which she and previous doctors had attributed to anxiety and caffeine consumption, could have been investigated further. This is not to assign blame. Neither Maria nor her doctors had reason to suspect a serious cardiac condition, but rather to highlight how interconnected our bodily systems are and how challenging it can be to see the complete picture when examining one aspect of health in isolation. The thin veil between sleep and death. Maria's story also illustrates the philosophical and existential questions that surround sleep-related deaths. Sleep and death have been poetically linked throughout human history, from Shakespeare's "To sleep, perchance to dream," to the ancient Greek concept of hypnos, sleep, and thanatos, death, being twin brothers. This connection isn't merely poetic. The state of deep sleep, with its slowed breathing, reduced heart rate, and diminished responsiveness, creates a physiological vulnerability that can, under certain circumstances, facilitate the transition from life to death. There's a neurological phenomenon called sleep state misperception that seems tragically relevant in Miss Sanchez's case, explains Dr. Natalie Wong, a neurologist specializing in sleep disorders. Some individuals with chronic insomnia actually sleep more than they perceive. Their brains partially wake during sleep cycles, creating the impression they've been awake all night. It's possible that Maria's brain was protecting her all those years by preventing her from entering the deepest sleep states where her heart was most vulnerable. This raises profound questions about the nature of sleep itself. Is the deepest sleep always the most restorative? Can insomnia sometimes be protective rather than pathological? How do we balance the vital need for sleep with the risks it might pose to certain individuals living with the specter of sleep death? For those who knew and loved Maria, her passing created a complicated relationship with sleep. Judith describes checking on her husband multiple times each night in the months following Maria's death. Ina installed pulse oximeters for everyone in her family. Maria's mother found herself afraid to nap during the day, fearful of not waking up. Grief creates its own kind of insomnia. Ina reflects, the cruel irony is that when you're most emotionally exhausted and in need of rest, sleep becomes elusive. After Maria died, I'd lie awake wondering if my heart might also have some hidden flaw. Every unusual sensation became terrifying. This hypervigilance represents a common response to sleep-related death in a loved one. The fundamental trust in sleep as a natural restorative process becomes damaged. The unconscious surrender that sleep requires feels suddenly dangerous. I had to learn to trust sleep again, Judith says. My therapist helped me understand that by depriving myself of proper rest, I was actually increasing my health risks, not protecting myself. It's been a journey to find that balance between reasonable precaution and paralyzing fear. The legacy of the last dream, 3 years after Maria's death, her impact continues to ripple through her community and beyond. The Maria Sanchez Sleep Heart Foundation has funded cardiac screening for over 1,500 people with sleep disorders, identifying 37 individuals with previously disorders, identifying 37 individuals with previously undetected conditions that might have proved fatal. The Regional Medical Center implemented new protocols for sleep disorder patients, including more comprehensive cardiac evaluations before prescribing certain medications. Dr. Chen now speaks at medical conferences about the importance of cross-specialty communication in patient-patient care. Maria's legacy is measured in the lives saved through her story, and the lives saved through her story, Anna says.
Each person who receives proper screening and treatment represents a family that won't have Stefani, that won't have Sadin. For those who knew Maria personally, the lack of Freddie, the lack of Frasians, what we went through, the library's garden blooms with the heirloom tomato varieties she loved, the shelter cats bask in the window of the room that bears her name, tomato variety that bears her name, the shelter cats bask in the window of the room that bears her name. Her mother still cooks her recipes and speaks to her photo each night before bed. I believe Maria's last dream was a gift, her mother says. After all those years of struggling with sleep, she finally experienced its true peace.
I tried to hold on to that in her final moments of consciousness, my daughter was floating weightless in warm waters, free from the fears that had constrained her waking life. In this perspective lies perhaps the most profound lesson from Maria's story, that even in tragedy, meaning can be found, that vulnerability can lead to protection for others, that the final dream, whatever it may be, need not be feared, but rather embraced as part of the great mystery that connects us all. For those concerned about sleep disorders or cardiac symptoms, please consult with healthcare professionals. The Maria Sanchez Sleep Heart Foundation provides resources and screening information at www.sleepheartfoundation.org. Note, the story of Maria Sanchez is a composite narrative based on several real cases of sleep-related death. While the specific individual is fictional, the medical conditions, circumstances, and emotional impacts depicted reflect documented experiences of those affected by sleep-related fatalities. David Chen met Sarah Abernathy at a support group for chronic pain patients in Chicago. He had been living with degenerative disc disease for 8 years. She managed fibromyalgia that had appeared following a car accident in her mid-20s. Their relationship blossomed, not despite their health challenges, but in many ways because of them. They shared an understanding of invisible suffering that those with healthy bodies often couldn't comprehend. We had this shorthand, David explains, his eyes fixed on the wedding photo on his mantle. I could just say it's a 7-day, and Sarah would know exactly what I meant, what I needed. No explanations, no justifications, just understanding. By the time they married in 2020, they had developed routines built around managing their respective conditions. Sarah worked remotely as a graphic designer, allowing her to adjust her schedule around flare-ups. David taught history at a community college, deliberately scheduling classes to avoid early morning hours when his pain peaked. Their bedroom contained evidence of their health management strategies: a specialized mattress that cost more than their car, prescription bottles neatly arranged on both nightstands, heating pads, cooling packs, supportive pillows, and a meditation system that played gentle sounds through speakers embedded in their headboard. People used to joke that our bedroom looked like a wellness spa met a pharmacy, David says with a sad smile, but it was what allowed us to function, to have some quality of life despite the pain. The silent edition, in January 2024, a particularly brutal winter, aggravated both their conditions. Sarah's fibromyalgia flared severely, leaving her in constant pain and struggling with the deep exhaustion that accompanied it. Her doctor suggested adjusting her medication regimen, adding a muscle relaxant to help with the widespread tension her body held. She was reluctant at first, recalls Megan Abernathy, Sarah's sister. Sarah was always incredibly careful about adding new medications because of potential interactions. She researched everything extensively. After consulting with both her rheumatologist and her pharmacist about potential interactions with her existing prescriptions, Sarah began taking the muscle relaxant in the evenings. The effect was transformative. She texted me about a week after starting it, Megan says. She said it was the first time in months she'd woken up feeling like she'd actually rested. The muscle tension would ease enough that she could actually sleep deeply. What neither Sarah,
her doctors, nor the pharmacist recognized was an unusual interaction occurring with an herbal supplement she had been taking for anxiety. The supplement, generally considered safe and available without prescription, contained compounds that affected how her liver metabolized the muscle relaxant. Instead of the medication maintaining steady levels in her system, it would occasionally spike to much higher concentrations than intended. The winter night, February 12, 2024, began as a typical Monday. David and Sarah worked from home due to heavy snowfall that had blanketed Chicago overnight. They ordered takeout for dinner, watched an episode of a series they had been following, and prepared for bed, according to their usual routine. Nothing seemed different that night, David remembers. Sarah mentioned her pain levels were manageable, about a 4, which was good for her during winter. We did our meditation together. I fell asleep before she did, which was normal. I always dropped off faster. The temperature that night dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, prompting them to run their heating system at a higher setting than usual. Their older apartment building used a radiator system that made the air exceptionally dry. To counteract this, they ran a humidifier in their bedroom, a practice recommended by their doctors to ease breathing and prevent their skin from becoming painfully dry. What they didn't know was that their humidifier had developed mold inside its reservoir, a common problem with such devices when not cleaned regularly enough. The mold released spores into the air of their sealed bedroom, creating an environmental trigger that would prove catastrophic given Sarah's particular sensitivities. The unnatural silence. David awoke at 6:30 a.m. to his alarm. Still groggy, he silenced it quickly and rolled over to check on Sarah. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully, something so rare that he was reluctant to wake her. She had this small smile on her face, he recalls, his voice breaking. She looked more relaxed than I had seen her in months. I thought she was finally getting the rest she desperately needed. He slipped quietly out of bed, showered, and prepared for his morning class. Before leaving, he placed a note on a nightstand. "You look so peaceful. I couldn't bear to wake you. Call me when you're up. Love you." At 11:45 a.m., between classes, David realized he hadn't heard from Sarah. He called her cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. Not particularly concerned, she often turned her phone off while working on detailed design projects. He sent a text and continued with his day. By 3:30 p.m., with no response to multiple messages, an unfamiliar anxiety began to build. Sarah was meticulous about communication. Even on her worst days, she would at least send a quick text to let him know she was struggling but okay. "I called our neighbor, Mrs. Petrova, and asked her to knock on our door," David says. "When Sarah didn't answer, something just, I knew. I left my class mid-lecture and drove home like a madman." The discovery David found Sarah and drove home like a madman. The discovery David found Sarah in the same position he had left her that morning, still with that slight smile on her face. His first thought was that she must be sleeping extraordinarily deeply. His second was that the room felt unusually still. "I called her name from the doorway, then louder beside her, shaking her." He remembers, her skin was cool, not cold, but not warm enough, not long enough, not alive enough. Despite knowing on some level what he would find, David began CPR while calling 911 on speaker. The dispatcher guided him through the process until paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. The dispatcher guided him through the process until paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. They continued resuscitation efforts, but ultimately pronounced Sarah dead at the scene. "The paramedic told me she had likely been gone for hours," David says, "that she had probably passed in the early morning. I had kissed her goodbye that morning, told her I had kissed her goodbye that morning, told her I loved her, while she was already gone. I didn't even know the complex truth." The medical examiner's investigation revealed a perfect storm of factors that had converged to claim Sarah's life. The interaction between her muscle relaxant and herbal supplement had caused an unusually high concentration of the medication in her system that night. The mold spores from the humidifier had triggered an inflammatory response in her airways, creating subtle respiratory distress. The deep muscle relaxation had prevented her body from rousing itself. When her oxygen levels began to drop, her fibromyalgia had likely caused her body to have a heightened inflammatory response to the mold, exacerbating the respiratory effects. The excessive dry heat from the radiators had further irritated her respiratory system. No single factor would have been fatal on its own. Together, they created conditions her body couldn't overcome. The most difficult part to accept, says Dr. Vivian McElroy, a pulmonologist who reviewed Sarah's case for a medical journal, is that, under normal circumstances, the body has protective mechanisms that would wake a person, respiratory distress. The combination of the sedative effect of the medication and the graduated nature of the inflammatory response likely prevented those mechanisms from functioning. In essence, Sarah's body had been quieted too effectively. The medication that helped her find relief from pain had also silenced her. The aftermath. In the weeks following Sarah's death, David found himself in a surreal, fugue state. The bedroom they had carefully crafted as a sanctuary now felt like a cleanse.
The medical examiner's report provided some comfort on this front, suggesting that Sarah likely never woke, that her transition from sleep to death had probably been without awareness or struggle. The muscle relaxant had ensured she remained deeply unconscious as her breathing gradually slowed. I wanted so badly to believe that, David says, that at least in the end, she found some peace from the pain that had defined so much of her life. For Sarah's family, the complex nature of her death made grief even more complicated. There was no single entity to blame, not the medication itself, which had provided genuine relief, not the doctors who had prescribed it appropriately based on the information they had, not even the humidifier which had simply not been maintained according to manufacturer recommendations. It's easier to grieve when there's someone to be angry at, Megan reflects. With Sarah, it was just this perfect alignment of small things that would have been harmless in isolation. How do you make peace with that kind of randomness? The hidden dangers of combined factors. Sarah's case exemplifies what medical professionals increasingly recognize as a significant concern in sleep-related deaths. The multiplicative, rather than merely additive effects of combining factors. Julian Ramirez, a pharmacologist specializing in drug interactions, explains, "We tend to think linearly about risk. If risk factor A adds 2% chance of adverse events and risk factor B adds 3%, we assume the combined risk is 5%. But certain combinations work synergistically, creating risk profiles that are exponentially higher than the sum of their parts." This synergy is particularly relevant in sleep medicine, where patients often combine prescription medications, over-the-counter remedies, supplements, and environmental modifications in their pursuit of rest. Patients with chronic conditions are often seeing multiple specialists, each managing different aspects of their health. Dr. Ramirez continues, Without perfect communication between these providers, which our fragmented healthcare system rarely facilitates, dangerous combinations can go unrecognized. In Sarah's case, her rheumatologist knew about her prescription medications but was unaware of the specific herbal supplement she had begun taking. The pharmacist, who dispensed her muscle relaxant, had checked for interactions with her other prescriptions, but not with supplements that didn't require a prescription. The allergist, who had previously treated her for seasonal allergies, wasn't consulted about the humidifier usage during winter months. Each provider was making appropriate recommendations within their sphere of expertise, says Dr. McElroy. The tragedy lies in the gaps between those spheres. Finding meaning in fragility. In the years since Sarah's death, David has channeled his grief into education and advocacy. He speaks at chronic pain support groups about the importance of comprehensive medication reviews that include supplements and over-the-counter remedies. He distributes information about proper humidifier maintenance and the dangers of mold exposure. I needed to make something constructive from this loss, he explains. Sarah was always the researcher in our relationship, the one who dug into the details, who asked the probing questions about treatments. I'm trying to honor that part of her by helping others ask those same questions. He has also found unexpected support from a sleep disorder support group, where many members have experienced close calls or lost loved ones to similar convergences of factors. There's something powerful about being understood, David says, about not having to explain why I now check my humidifier obsessively, why I get panicky if someone I care about doesn't answer their phone promptly. These people get it without explanation. The night watch. Perhaps the most profound change in David's life has been his relationship with sleep itself. Once a reliable escape from his physical pain, sleep has become fraught with complicated emotions and vigilance. I developed this habit of waking up throughout the night to check my breathing, he admits. I'd set alarms every 2 hours just to make sure I could rouse myself. My doctor finally convinced me to do a sleep study to prove to myself that my breathing was stable through the night. This hypervigilance represents a common response to sleep-related death in proximity, what some psychologists call sleep trauma response. The natural vulnerability of sleep becomes magnified in consciousness, creating anxiety that itself disrupts healthy sleep patterns. It creates this terrible cycle, explains Dr. Leanna Peterson, a psychologist specializing in grief and trauma. The anxiety about sleep prevents restful sleep, which increases physical and emotional fatigue, which in turn intensifies anxiety. Breaking this cycle often requires both psychological support and sometimes short-term medical intervention. For David, healing has come gradually through therapy, through connecting with others who understand his loss, and through transforming his pain into purpose. He has recently begun dating again, tentatively, with someone he met through the chronic pain support group, where his relationship with Sarah began. Sarah would want me to find joy again, he says. We both lived with the understanding that life is fragile, that comfort is precious. If anything, her death deepened that understanding for me. I don't take a single pain-free moment for granted now. I don't take a single deep breath for granted. The broader lessons Sarah's story carries important lessons for the millions who struggle with chronic conditions and rely on complex medication regimens to function. Comprehensive medication reviews are essential, including supplements, herbal remedies, and over-the-counter medications. These reviews should be conducted regularly and whenever new treatments are added. Environmental factors matter, particularly for those with respiratory sensitivities or compromised immune systems. Proper maintenance of devices like humidifiers, air purifiers, and CPAP machines is not merely a cleanliness issue, but a safety concern. Communication between specialists is vital, but often requires patient advocacy. Bringing complete medication lists to every appointment and ensuring all providers are aware of treatments prescribed by others can identify potential interactions before they become dangerous. Sleep monitoring devices may provide an additional safety layer for those at high risk due to medication regimens or respiratory conditions. While not necessary for everyone, these devices can detect abnormal breathing patterns and oxygen levels during sleep. Regular reassessment of long-standing treatments is important as bodies change and new research emerges. What worked safely at one point in life may create new risks as other aspects of health evolve. The final piece: on the anniversary of Sarah's death, David returned to the support group where they first met, carrying a photograph of her and a message for those still navigating the challenges of chronic pain. Sarah lived 34 years, he told the group, 20 of those with daily pain. But when I think of her now, it's not the pain I remember most vividly, it's her laugh, her passion for color theory and typography, the way she could sit for hours watching snow fall outside our window. She taught me that a life with pain is still a life worth living fully. He paused, looking down at her photo, Sarah grinning widely, despite what he knew was a high-pain day when the picture was taken. The final gift she gave me, though she never intended it this way, was perspective. In the randomness of how she died, I found this strange gratitude for the predictability of my own path. At least my enemy has a name, a pattern I understand. Sarah reminds me, daily, not to let the fear of what might happen prevent me from appreciating what is happening. As David speaks with me for this story, night has fallen. He glances at his watch and notes that it's time for his evening medication routine. He moves to his bathroom, organizing pills with practiced efficiency. Before taking them, he pauses. I think what most people don't understand about chronic conditions is that you're always balancing risks, he reflects. The risk of pain against the risk of medication side effects, the risk of activity against the risk of immobility. Sarah understood that dance intimately. What happened to her was extraordinarily rare, a perfect alignment of factors that couldn't have been predicted. He swallows his medications with a precise amount of water, then continues, I could choose to see her death as a reason to fear sleep, to fear medication, to fear the very things that make my condition manageable. Instead, I've chosen to see it as a reminder that even our most carefully controlled environments contain uncertainties, and that's not a reason to stop living, it's a reason to live more mindfully. David turns out his bathroom light, prepares for sleep, a simple act that for him now carries layers of meaning unknown to most. On his nightstand sits a small framed quote that Sarah had pinned above her design workspace. It reads simply, rest is never wasted time. It reads simply, rest is never wasted time. For those managing chronic conditions with complex medication regimens, experts recommend regular comprehensive medication reviews with healthcare providers, including discussion of use with healthcare providers, including discussion of all supplements and over-the-counter remedies. Proper maintenance of all home health equipment, including humidifiers, is essential for safe operation. Note: David and Sarah's story is a composite narrative based on several documented cases of sleep-related deaths involving medication interactions, environmental factors. While the specific individuals are fictional, the medical conditions, circumstances, and emotional impacts depicted reflect real experiences of those affected by such tragedies.